Welcome to the Digital Dispatch, a podcast series that covers what's going on in technology policy today and what that means for the geopolitics and society of tomorrow.
Oftentimes, hackers want to get the breaches public because it puts more pressure on the victim, particularly in ransomware cases. And so you're sort of caught in the middle of this because you want to hold these companies accountable. At the same time, though, you're stuck in this quandary of aiding and abetting in certain ways the ransomware hackers in applying that pressure.
On today's episode, Jim and I talk about the current status of federal privacy legislation in the context of policy debates around artificial intelligence. After that, investigative journalist Kim Zetter joins the podcast to reflect upon the trends in cybersecurity and national security that we're seeing today. All right, Jim, here's the situation. We're heading into August recess. There's obviously a lot of attention focused on the elections right now, but we're still seeing some focus on data privacy. On July 11th, the Senate Commerce Committee held a hearing where members restated their bipartisan interest in privacy, even though their most recent attempt at legislation is at a standstill. So what do you make of this? There are still 5 months left in 2024. Is privacy legislation still a realistic policy goal for this year?
I've given up betting on privacy legislation.
How long ago?
Because I've lost every bet. So a couple of years ago, I would say this is the year we would finally get privacy legislation. And it didn't happen then. I don't think it's going to happen now. Eventually, it will have to happen. And I think the big change is whereas the tech companies previously resisted legislation, they now are eager to get it because it will preempt a lot of the state rules. We're seeing the states got tired of waiting for Congress, like many, and moved ahead on their own. So it's probably within, who knows, the next 2 or 3 years, we'll see privacy legislation, but not this year.
What I'm trying to figure out, though, is we have the tech companies saying we want a federal law that preempts state laws. We have both Democrats and Republicans saying privacy is an important issue. There's bipartisan interest. We have the EU. We have other governments saying, when is the United States going to get a federal privacy law? So with all of this consensus, just what is the holdup? Is it due to politics, or are there actual substantive policy issues within privacy legislation that Congress still needs to work out?
It's politics, but a lot of it is because there are substantive issues that until you get into the details of privacy legislation, you don't understand.
Yeah.
And so if you were looking for a model, the FISA debate, where you had a powerful incentive to pass legislation, all of that, all the concerns, the bipartisan split, the worries about how data would be used. It's just a replay in some ways. The privacy debate is a replay in some ways of that earlier FISA thing. And the difference is it's easier to renew a law than to create a new one. So I think we'll get there eventually, but there's not enough consensus on some core issues.
Yeah, it's easier to renew a law, and then it also doesn't hurt if you have a deadline to motivate you. Historically, the two most controversial issues have been preemption and private right of action. And those are still sticking points, but increasingly, and Jim, let me know if this is your observation too, I'm seeing this focus on AI. In other words, if a new privacy law were to limit the way in which companies can legally process personal information, how does that affect the way in which AI developers operate? And I think lawmakers are really interested in striking the right balance, and I'm not sure if we're there yet.
They are interested in striking the right balance, and we just don't know enough to, if we were only Europeans and would imagine threats and deal with those imaginary threats, it would be a lot easier. But there's not enough data to go on. And, people, to their credit, on the Hill are worried that if we get it wrong, we'll hurt the potential for economic growth that AI brings with it. So it's not clear. We don't have enough data. There's a lot of hypothetical situations, very few in the real world.
Yeah. So I have a question. When do you think we'll have enough data? I mean, AI is already being deployed in all sectors of the economy.
If you had told me in advance, I would have asked ChatGPT for that answer.
We still can. Yeah. We can pull out our phones right now.
That's right.
I mean, I don't know. I think this, in many ways, it's like the classic regulation versus innovation debate that we've had not only with AI, but with all technologies. On one hand, AI actually increases the need for privacy protections, right? I mean, there's more data collection. Right.
You think? No, I think it's still the same. I mean, we need privacy protection.
Yeah.
I don't know if AI changes it that much.
I don't know. I mean, AI just really expands the way in which companies can gather information about people. It can predict or infer details about people that humans otherwise would have a very difficult time doing.
One thing we learned from the facial recognition debate is inference is a bad idea because we aren't good enough at it. So using it to make predictions about how people will behave, there's some risk there. And that's probably worth some attention.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think it's worth attention, but at the same time, regulation has to be flexible enough to allow innovation and allow the United States to continue to compete globally. But I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. I think it's still possible to put down clear rules, but at the same time, also still allow companies to innovate.
Some of it's the difference in how we do law and how the Anglo-Saxon world does law, which is sort of an old-fashioned term, but it's built on experience, right? It's not built on predictions. And so we just don't have enough experience with how this works. That could change rapidly given the rate of adoption of some of the more advanced software used for AI purposes. But we aren't there yet.
Yeah. But the other really interesting thing that happened in the past month, and to me this is one of the biggest indicators that Congress is shifting its stance on privacy, is the changes to the American Privacy Rights Act. So in late June, the co-sponsors of APRA actually decided to remove proposed legislative provisions that would have required companies to conduct assessments to understand the impacts of their algorithms. And they also removed provisions that would have essentially said that companies can't produce outcomes that would violate civil rights. For example, they can't use somebody's personal information to unfairly determine employment or mortgage decisions. So I'm going to be honest, I was actually pretty surprised that these protections were removed because I thought they were relatively non-controversial. They've been in privacy legislation for a few years now. And
where, though? Where?
In various bills. I mean, various iterations of the American Privacy Rights Act, the Consumer Online Privacy Rights Act, the COPRA, and others.
It sounds, the first one sounds a little academic. You do an assessment. That's bad because it's basically an added expense. It doesn't get you that much. Academics like doing assessments, but I'm not sure how much it actually improves the situation. Better to have clear rules. On the discrimination part, you can see why it might not have the data behind it to make the case. So in both of these, the one thing that I think is percolating through people's thinking is the Europeans regulated, they put costs on their companies, and it drove them out of business. And that's what we should try and avoid.
So is the concern that these assessments would just be like red tape that increase compliance costs but don't actually improve privacy?
That's a perfect description. I mean, that's like saying you should assess your ability to drive before you get in the car. No, set a speed limit and then fine you if you go over it.
I mean, though, I would imagine that from the perspective of a company, it's probably not good PR, though, to say that we don't know what the effects of our algorithms are. We don't know how it affects people.
Yeah, to the extent they don't. I mean, that assumes how these things will be used. And so one of the things that makes me confident that we'll eventually, probably in this century, have privacy legislation is that more and more things are being done with advanced software. More and more tasks are being automated. The society is becoming more digital. We're just going to see this kind of change coming whenever we get enough data to justify writing a bill.
And the other side of the coin, Jim, is regulatory certainty. And that's where the EU, which we've talked about, plus the states are really interesting factors. Right now, we have 19 states with comprehensive privacy laws, all of which were passed within the past 6 years, plus the EU with the GDPR, the AI Act, the Digital Markets Act, and whatever's coming next, plus dozens of countries that are all passing laws that affect data processing. And I remember back in 2018 when California became the first state to pass a privacy law, everyone, even the big companies, were saying we need to avoid this patchwork of state laws. So it's 2024. I don't know if I
But
necessarily.
who's counting?
Yeah, but who's counting? I don't know if I am necessarily seeing evidence that this patchwork alone, whether it's the state pressure or the global pressure, is really motivating, propelling Congress towards privacy legislation. But I do think that it's possible to help companies or help innovation by actually increasing regulatory certainty.
Eventually there'll have to be federal preemption because you can't have 50 different laws that overlap in some areas and don't in others. So eventually we'll see federal preemption. I'm not sure the European precedent is that useful because the European approach is so different and so risky that will cause concern.
Yeah.
Enough people know about the real Brussels effect, which is to kill economic growth, that they're going to be cautious. But preempting multiple state laws, that's normal practice for Congress. And if Congress was a little more functional, which we can hope for in 2025, I think you might get something. So I'll say it again. I'll probably regret it. Maybe 2025 we'll get a privacy bill.
Well, Congress did ban TikTok, so it is theoretically possible for it to pass bipartisan legislation.
But that's because they don't like lip syncing. They don't like lip syncing in China. So.
What I mean, who doesn't like lip syncing?
I don't like lip syncing. And apparently enough members of the Congress don't. Remember, TikTok was described as a karaoke app when it was put on the market. So I'm not sure how useful it is as a precedent for this because it is largely focused on China and the fear about Chinese influence ops, whereas this is how do you get economic growth? There's a general sense, the partisan issue, and this might be one that would be useful to know what you think. Republicans have a fear about the big tech companies and how they use data. Democrats have a fear of the big tech company and how they use data. And there's some overlap, but not complete overlap. So is that going to be an obstacle for privacy legislation?
Right. There are bipartisan concerns about technology. However, there isn't bipartisan agreement on what to do about it.
Yeah.
Well, I think that really concludes where we are today. So thanks for joining us, Jim. And to our listeners, stay tuned. We'll be back on the Digital Dispatch next with an interview with Kim Zetter. Next on the podcast, we're joined by Kim Zetter, an investigative journalist who has covered cyber and national security stories ranging from WikiLeaks to electronic voting machines to the hacker underground. Kim is also the author of the book Countdown to Zero Day, Stuxnet and the Launch of the World's First Digital Weapon. Kim, throughout your career, you've covered both offensive and defensive cyber capabilities. And I think this is a really interesting dynamic. On the one hand, governments have invested significant resources into shoring up cyber defenses to preventing data breaches and protecting the resilience of networks and communications through encryption or other privacy-enhancing technologies. On the other hand, we're also seeing some governments that have sought to enhance their access to the data that others hold through both voluntary and compelled means, and for a wide range of purposes that often fall under this broad bucket of national security. So from your vantage point, how has this balance between protecting privacy and promoting national security evolved over time?
So you've got the defense side that it ranges from commercial defense and government defense of systems to then offense that can be either criminal activity or nation state. I think I'll focus on the nation state since that's mostly what we think of when we talk about offensive operations. I think that we have decades of incidents, major and significant breaches that have occurred against US government systems, but of course against other government systems as well. And we haven't done a good job of defending against those kinds of breaches. And every time they happen, of course, it always comes down to some quite often minor way that the attackers have gotten in. The most recent one was, of course, the SolarWinds breach, which was very sophisticated in the way the hackers got into the SolarWinds software update. A small summary was that The hackers, Russian, got into a company called SolarWinds, which makes a monitoring tool that's used in government systems and corporate systems. And they got into the software update so that they managed to implant a backdoor into software that was then delivered to customers. So they did that in a really sophisticated way that allowed them to not get caught. However, the operation was enabled for some really kind of silly reasons. The fact that victim systems were connected to the internet when they shouldn't have been. The SolarWinds servers are designed for internal monitoring of a network, and they don't necessarily need to be connected externally. Maybe to get software updates, but you can also get software updates offline. So, they targeted at least 9 federal agencies that we know of, and the hackers extracted emails and other data. And that wouldn't have worked in any of those cases if those servers hadn't been connected to the internet. The attack simply couldn't have progressed to that level. So there's that issue of not necessarily following best practices regarding systems. We've seen also there have been these breaches against Snowflake cloud storage accounts. And in that case, the people managing Snowflake accounts didn't have multi-factor authentication. So when you ask the question of like how we're doing with defense, we're not doing very well. Often, like I said, the problems that come up seem to be very minor. With regard to offense, I mean, that has really evolved over the years. Stuxnet, of course, was what we consider sort of the state of the art standard in offensive operations, very sophisticated, going after industrial control systems in Iran to sabotage Iran's nuclear program. We haven't seen anything to that level of sophistication since then, but we don't catch everything, so we don't really know if there have been other attacks. But certainly offensive operations have become hugely widespread. When Stuxnet occurred in 2010, when it was uncovered, there were only a handful of countries that were engaged in offensive operations like that. And now there are more than 24, and a number of them have very sophisticated capabilities. So it's really advanced in that way.
So several trends that I'm hearing are more sophistication, more quantity, and potentially more scope and impact of both the offensive and the defensive operations. You mentioned that with SolarWinds, for example, 9 federal agencies were targeted. Are we seeing that awareness of data security or awareness of privacy is increasing among policymakers and the public over time?
Yes, definitely policymakers have woken up to the issues, and they've tried to address it in sort of like a hammer and a nail way. DHS has done a better job of trying to pass directives to try and get systems up to sort of a base level of security. We have had some legislation that requires reporting now, and we've had some legislation in industries that are regulated that require base level of security. So there's definitely a lot more awareness. We can thank the Colonial Pipeline breach for that, but I think that we still have a long way to go. One of the problems, at least with critical infrastructure, is that it is owned by private sector for the most part. And in many cases, if we're talking specifically about sort of water treatment facilities, they don't have the resources to even hire a full-time security person in order to understand what they need to do in order to bring them up to a certain level. So we've seen that in a couple of cases where there have been breaches of water treatment facilities in the US, and we find that they had legacy accounts that weren't protected, software that wasn't updated. Again, basic problems, but we're talking critical infrastructure here, and we don't have a focus on where they need to be or assistance to help them get there.
What about the public? Is there anything that individual people or individual companies could be doing better to enhance cybersecurity?
I think that if we look at the snowflake, the lack of multi-factor authentication, I think that if anyone is not using multi-factor authentication on critical systems that are storing data anymore, then that's real negligence at this point because there's not really an excuse for not using it. There's not really an excuse for not enabling it. If you're a company that's providing criticals data storage, things like that, you really should be having multi-factor authentication as, if not the default, at least heavily pushed to customers. And I know that Snowflake in this case is moving toward in that direction, pushing it out in a way that would more aggressively encourage, I guess, customers to be using it. So again, there are a lot of things like that. It's not like we don't know what to do to secure systems. The problem is actually getting people to do them and getting them to do them in a consistent manner.
Yeah. I think that a lot of people are very aware of the importance of defensive cybersecurity. For example, multi factor authentication or changing your passwords, even if not all of us do it all the time. However, I do think that there's sort of a gap in awareness, especially about the offensive capabilities, about how governments, and especially the United States, are investing not just in defensive cyber, but then also how, like with the North Korea, how the United States could potentially invest in like offensive cyber capabilities as well.
Yes, and we don't really know what the budgets are for these because they're hidden budgets. We know that DARPA has worked on some projects for offensive operations for government. We know that contractors like Northrop Grumman and others have also worked on these operations. They're not visible, so we can't really see the extent to which this is happening. But then it's not obviously the US. It's, like I said, there were dozens of countries that are now engaged in this. And so we don't really even know what the state of the art is at the moment.
Right. And right now, all 50 states have some sort of data breach notification law in place to let affected customers know if they're targeted by a cyber attack. But for the broader public, I think a lot of what we know about major cybersecurity incidents are from journalists. Journalists just play such a huge role in increasing accountability over private companies and government agencies, as well as general transparency over data practices. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this role, especially given your position as a journalist, especially over so many major events over the past decade.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting what you talk about the sort of that role of notifying the public because it's kind of a fine line that you walk because oftentimes hackers want to get the breaches public because it puts more pressure on the victim, particularly in ransomware cases. It puts more pressure on the victim if the breach is public to get that victim to pay the ransom. And so you're sort of caught in the middle of this because you want to hold the victims accountable. You want to hold these companies accountable for maybe if they've been negligent in terms of securing. At the same time, though, you're stuck in this quandary of aiding and abetting in certain ways the ransomware hackers in applying that pressure. So it is sort of a fine line that you have to run and trusting what the hackers tell you about the breaches. Those have to be verified, especially in the case of where it may be really, really sensitive information and you don't want to jump the gun in publicizing something that you're not sure is accurate. So yeah, so there is that fine line, but yeah, I think that journalists play a very important role in trying to get accountability for consumers whose data gets stolen, and for also not letting the story go from the first day. Oftentimes, we'll see a story about the breach, and then you never hear anything about it again, but that follow-up to find out what led to the breach and what was the backstory behind it and whether there was any kind of negligence. We saw that with the SolarWinds case, where stories started coming out after the breach became public about some ways that SolarWinds had been told and warned for years about the lack of security and the fact that they didn't even have a full-time security person on staff. Those stories that come out post-breach are also important.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That balance that you mentioned between, I mean, at times not wanting to draw public attention or to potentially aid the hackers, and especially in very real time situations, but at the same time, making sure that the public is informed and holding corporations accountable for their practices. It also, I think, goes to, I think, the role of journalists in reporting very real time news as opposed to reflecting back on some of the lessons that we've learned in the past.
I think that we've seen some real efforts by government to try and address some of the core issues that have come up in sort of major breaches like SolarWinds, and Colonial Pipeline. We saw them try and address it with some kind of regulation around companies. There, the problem is, of course, enforcement. How do you make sure that companies not only get security, reach a certain level of security the first time, but also maintain that over time? We've seen the government and CISA in particular start initiatives for supply chain security. So there's it's like the beginning steps of efforts, but these problems are so big. We've also seen some efforts to go after trying to make open source software more secure. So open source software, is usually maintained by volunteers when they have time to look for vulnerabilities and patch those. And because that software is used in so many critical systems, there really needs to be more attention focused on community efforts to get those secure. So the government has learned from a lot of these incidents and have tried to address it piecemeal. These are huge problems and they're not easily solved. But it's very encouraging that the government and lawmakers have recognized and responded to the incidents when they occur and are at least taking steps to try and address them. I don't know whether the steps that they're taking will actually address them, but at least they're doing something.
Yeah, huge problems and definitely getting more complex, especially as data collection increases in the public and the private sectors, as well as the number of actors or the potential risk vectors in the life cycle of data. So, is there anything else that you're keeping your eyes to the ground on, like any other trends or debates within cyber that we, the audience, should be following now that you think will continue to become especially impactful in the future?
Well, something that we're seeing recently, like in June when the Snowflake incidents happened, the initial reporting was that the hackers claimed they actually breached Snowflake itself. Snowflake is a data storage and data analysis company. The initial reports were that they breached Snowflake directly. And then we learned that no, they didn't actually breach Snowflake directly. They were able to obtain the credentials for Snowflake accounts by sifting through repositories online of previously stolen credentials. So we're talking about info stealers, malware that sits on computers and harvests usernames and passwords. And they're very successful, and they have been very successful for the last decade. So what happens with all that data, right? When a breach occurs, we never follow that afterward, right? A breach occurs, you get a notice from your company or whoever was storing your data that your data has been stolen. They give you some credit to reporting subscription for a year. But the problem is that many people don't know necessarily that their data has been stolen. They also reuse these credentials over and over on accounts so that even if it's stolen from, let's say, an email account, they may be reusing that for their banking account and for other things. And the hackers are counting on that. And so these repositories of data can sit there for a decade online for sale to hackers. And what we're found with Snowflake is that they actually went back and were looking through those old repositories and finding credentials for other things that were still active. And that allowed them to get into Snowflake accounts. So I think that we're just starting to see early warnings of this from people in the security community that this info stealer problem is going to become bigger and bigger because the hackers, they don't have to do much work. The credentials are already out there. And so it really is incumbent upon users, one, to not reuse credentials over and over again in particularly critical accounts. And secondly, to be changing those passwords often so that if they do get breached and you don't know if they've been breached, that a hacker won't be able to make use of them. And then thirdly, of course, using multi-factor authentication wherever you can. Because if they can look at those passwords, if they can obtain those credentials won't help them if you're using multi-factor authentication. So I think that that's going to become a bigger trend until we figure out ways to address that and convince people that they need to be changing these passwords or we force password changes on them. One other issue that we really haven't seen a manifestation of this, but it's a concern that I've had for more than a decade now. And these are integrity attacks. So what we see a lot, we see espionage, we see cyber criminals grabbing data, and we see all the various ways in which they use that data or try to monetize it. But one thing that we haven't seen, and it's because I think it's hard to detect, is integrity attacks. So by integrity attacks, I'm talking about altering data in a repository, altering data in ways that maybe isn't detectable, but can have huge impacts. When we talk about election security, of course, that's what we're talking about. Potentially someone getting into voter registration databases and altering the record so people can't vote, or even getting in and altering election results. But integrity attacks go far beyond that. Because software is used in everything, including weapon systems, and we've got supply chain issues. We see what happened with SolarWinds when the hackers were able to get into that software. Integrity attacks can do much more. You can get in and alter software in ways that it won't work properly. And whether that's an accounting software that causes banking system transactions to be off by a few pennies, or whether it's integrity attacks in software used in weapon systems that, for instance, cause the weapons to not be able to be launched towards a target. So I think that that's a problem that we're going to be seeing more and more, is this kind of integrity issue. And we don't really talk about it very much because it's really hard to address, and it's also hard to detect.
Yeah, I can imagine. Have we seen any examples that have been detected of integrity attacks so far? Or is this more something that could potentially happen in the future, or something that could potentially be happening, but we just don't have very clear examples of yet?
I mean, you could sort of call the SolarWinds thing an integrity attack because people were downloading software without realizing that it was backdoored. But when I'm
Mhm.
talking about integrity attacks, I'm really talking about altering the code or altering data itself. And we see sort of examples of this as sort of surface examples when hackers extract data and then leak it online. And there's the question of how they altered that data before they leaked it. So that's sort of like a basic front facing kind of integrity issue. But I'm talking about really the back end things in the supply chain or in like election results or accounting where you don't notice it. And I think that it's really hard to detect these. I think that years ago there was a problem with an accounting software, a database software called Lotus 123. And it was a problem with the calculation in data in the database that would cause occasionally a calculation to be off by, I don't know, point zero zero calculation. And on the surface, that seems really minor, but over time, if you're talking about using it for accounting purposes, that can result in a lot of money discrepancies. So these are the kinds of thing that you won't necessarily notice, a few pennies here and there, but over time they can have a huge impact. And also with weapon systems, right? So when weapon systems go wrong, when a missile doesn't quite fire the way it's supposed to, or it doesn't quite fire where it needs to go, you don't know if that's just a glitch that's occurred or if that's something that's intentional. We have had reporting that's touched on this. The New York Times reported years ago that the US was launching integrity attacks against North Korean missile systems. And so when you were seeing North Korea launch these test missiles, quite often they were going up and then they were immediately dropping in the ocean. So there was a problem there with how the missiles were working. And the New York Times had indicated that it was because there was some sabotage going on in the code prior to these tests. So those kinds of things are often difficult to detect, to answer your question, because you can never necessarily distinguish between what is simply a malfunction and what is sort of intentional sabotage.
Yeah, and maybe that's something that will become more visible in the future, especially due to the work of journalists like yourself. So, thank you so much, Kim, for joining us today on the Digital Dispatch. This has just been such an interesting conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.